Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for part 5 of our Building a Security Program series, Who Watches the Watchmen? Oversight and Compliance. So this is our final webinar in our Building a Security Program series, so we're very excited about this and we want to thank you all for joining us. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question box. We'll answer all questions at the end. And this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website for download. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Paul.
Thanks, Robin. And thanks everybody for attending today, and a special thanks to anybody who's attended all 5 parts of our series. We wanted to put this together so that we could deliver some useful information out to the community in terms of how do we really get from beginning to end on building a security program, and that's really what we're going to close out today on is how do we finish this out and ensure that the things that we're learning through iterating through this life cycle are being fed back into the process so that we're getting better and better over time. Those of you who've heard us go through some of these other webinars, not just within this program construct, but also some of the other ones, will know that we typically have a focus more so on security than on compliance. And so it may be interesting to you to hear us talk about compliance today, because it certainly is a critical component of any security program, but not necessarily the sole focus. Our mantra, as I'm sure you've heard us say before, is that security should be the goal, and compliance really will flow from a good, secure program, but not necessarily the other way around. And I say not necessarily because it certainly can, but you have to be looking at the problem from the right perspective. And I think that's what we're going to really try to touch on today, is how do we close the loop on compliance via an oversight process that really enables a functional security program. So a little bit about myself. I'm Paul. I've got about 17 years of information security experience. As always, I'm open to your questions via any of these communication channels that I've listed here. So if you'd like to, reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, or shoot me an email at that address there. If you have a question, I can take that after the webinar at any point in time. So please feel free to reach out. A little bit about TruShield. So we're a global cyber company that's based in Washington, D.C. We've been in business for about 10 years now. We've got services kind of running the full scope of cybersecurity, from program building, like what we're talking about today, to the really tactical operational tasks around continuous security monitoring and incident response and things like that. Just know that we're here for you, so if you have problems or challenges that you're running up against that you're not quite sure how to solve, reach out to us. We can almost certainly help you. So as we said earlier, this is a 5-part program, and our intent was to help establish this roadmap on how do we get to a functional cybersecurity program. And in our view, that program roadmap has 5 key parts. I'll quickly run through this again, and if you, again, want to look back at our website, you can download any of these webinars at any point in time. But we started it with governance way back in February, talking about how does leadership set the tone for the organization that everybody must march to with respect to information governance, and respect to risk management and security at the top level of the organization, and then how does it flow down from there. And then we started talking about policies in March, about a month later. How do we enable and write policy that is in line with the corporate objectives, with corporate strategy, and also in line with any regulatory environment concerns that have to be taken into account? And then how do we actually create those in a manner that's practical? And then with the 3rd webinar, we talked about process, and process is really how we implement those policies in a manner that is repeatable, sustainable, scalable, and measurable. And that was really the key thing we were talking about there. How do we make sure that we can learn from the process that we're going through so that we get better each time we do it? And then on part 4, the last webinar that we had in May, we talked about security controls specifically, and how do we implement security controls that are going to be sufficient to meet the rigors of the regulatory environment and also fall within the construct of the operational environment that we're actually living within. And so today, again, we're going to close the loop on that, talking about how do we measure ourselves at a high level across all of these areas and feed that information into the governance construct so that, again, we can get better and better over time, all within the construct of that compliance perspective. So again, the program really starts with governance at the very top, flows into policies. Process is how we implement policies. Controls are how we take process and apply it to the operational and technical environment. And then oversight and compliance is how we're going to take output from all of these different areas of the program and learn from it and feed that back into the governance process so that we can adjust and adapt and overcome the challenges that we're observing in a day-to-day basis. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about the oversight and compliance process. We're going to talk about the audit process, and that audit process can be either an internal audit or an external audit. We're going to give some perspectives on how to go about assessing controls, what different methods can be used to assess controls, and then we're going to talk about what do you need to do after an assessment. Again, we'll have a question and answer session at the end, so feel free to chime in by typing your question into the question box, and we'll get to that at the end. So the oversight and compliance process, what does this actually look like? Really, there's, like any other process, we consider this to be a life cycle. It's something that is not just a single point in time, and it's something that you've got to iterate through multiple times and attempt to get better at each time you go through it. That process of continuous improvement is really the ultimate goal for the oversight and compliance. We want to take a look at some key things when we're looking at the oversight process. First off, the policies and controls. Obviously, we need to review how those policies fit within the strategy of the organization and how that aligns with the regulatory environment. And we've got to be looking at that from a perspective that is balanced against both compliance and security. Because as you know from hearing us talk previously, it's certainly possible to implement a compliant security program that doesn't actually meet the requirements of security. We'll talk more about that in a little while as well. But really we're addressing the policies and controls by reviewing them on a one-by-one basis against that framework, be it NIST or be it PCI or FFIEC or whatever it is, learning whether or not those policies are something that can actually support the requirement. We then need to monitor them, monitor whether or not we're actually in compliant with the policy. Are we doing the things that we're supposed to be doing? Are we using the correct password length, complexity, etc.? Are we doing the right background checks for our employees? Whatever the policies are that we're reviewing, we need to make sure that we're actually executing on them correctly. Where we find issues with execution, we've got to make sure that we're enforcing those requirements. That might mean that there's some disciplinary action if an employee is outside of the requirement of policy. We also need to measure how well we're doing with respect to policy compliance, with respect to executing on those different areas of compliance that we've got to be executing to. Those measurements, we talked earlier about metrics and measurements in an information security program, and things that you can measure to determine how well you're doing include things like how many vulnerabilities we still have, how quickly are we patching our vulnerabilities, how quickly are we able to respond to and recover from incidents, and things like that. And then, of course, we've got to make sure that that's all taken into account the entirety of the environment. And that really is that discovery component. It's impossible to do compliance and risk management without having a very firm understanding of what the full environment looks like. And so really that's kind of the foundational component of this, is make sure that you know what your environment looks like so that everything can be based upon a full understanding of what your potential risk posture is. Because again, it's certainly possible to construct a compliant environment that meets the requirements of a regulatory compliance mandate, but doesn't actually implement security. There are some very good examples of this across multiple industries. Thinking of Target and Home Depot in the retail space, both of them were PCI compliant, however still had major security issues and data breaches that probably some of you were impacted by. The Office of Personnel and Management is another one that was FSMA compliant, but again had a massive data breach because while the boxes were checked that indicated that compliance was in place, perhaps there was not sufficient review of how well the policies were being executed, how well the controls were actually protecting personally identifiable information, things like that. If you're not actually able to attest via observation or testing whether or not a control is effective, you're likely going to be in a situation where you might be compliant on paper but still not secure. And that's really a challenging thing to do because oversight requires a lot of different moving parts to kind of line up in a manner that makes sense. You got to have big picture knowledge of what the environment looks like. You got to have that full asset inventory of what exactly is within my environment so that you can understand how there's risk applies to it. You've also got to understand, again, from that big picture, what's the corporate strategy? What is the thing that leadership is kind of driving the environment to? And that really will flow component we talked about way back at the beginning. Oversight also requires some technical depth. I've seen it happen in the past where an independent auditor comes in to perform an assessment against an environment and doesn't really have enough understanding of the technical control sets to really assess whether or not they're functional. And in environments like that, in situations like that, it's actually kind of easy to trick an auditor. And you know, that's very self-defeating when I see that sort of thing happen, because you're being driven to have an independent assessment done, but you're really only kind of propping yourself up with a false sense of security when that occurs. So auditors really have to have a good technical acumen in order to kind of avoid that and really drill down to whether or not a control is effective or not. Then the key thing to take from there is those technical deficiencies that we identified, how do those translate over to the business? How can I as an auditor explain that to senior leadership that, you know, this particular control weakness could potentially cause business risk to the organization? And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. There's a particular set of skills required to be able to translate that sort of technical information to a business person, and an auditor really has to have that part down. So that auditor really's got to come to the table with the right skills, has to have the right approach and not be adversarial. That adversarial approach as an auditor is very counterproductive. Oftentimes, auditors will come in to an environment where the auditee is looking at the auditor as someone who's going to point out their weaknesses and kind of make their life difficult. And that really can't be the approach of the auditor. The auditor's got to be looking at it as a collaboration on trying to move the organization forward towards where management is trying to take the organization, and not so much from a adversary's perspective, really working together to achieve a common goal. And at the end of the day, the auditor has to be independent, has to have that freedom from bias. And what we're really talking about there is, while you can certainly do internal audits, at the end of the day, somebody who is not part of the reporting chain for the system development lifecycle, or in the responsibility chain for having had implemented some control, that has to exist. You can't have an auditor that has had responsibility for implementing control, because there's just too much opportunity for bias to influence the results there. So it's challenging from a high-level oversight, because there's again so many of these different components that have to be there for the auditor to be able to do a good job. And it's not so easy to find that with internal assets, especially at small to mid-sized organizations who don't have an independent internal audit organization, that have to rely upon an outsider. That outsider may have the technical depth, may be able to translate technical deficiencies to business impacts, but maybe doesn't have the big picture of what the organization is trying to do. And so filling these gaps and making sure you've got coverage across each of these areas is really critical to having this oversight function actually work correctly. Because at the end of the day, there are many, many different components of enterprise risk that have to be taken into account when you're doing the oversight and compliance function. Of course, you've got the regulation and policy compliance aspect of it that we're really trying to assess ourselves against. But at the end of the day, we're looking past compliance, right? We're looking at risk to the organization as a whole. And what that's comprised upon is, first and foremost, what's the mission of the organization? What is driving this business forward? And then following that, do we have the right resources, skills, and training in order to be able to accomplish the mission and drive the business where we need it to go? Does our architecture support that? Are we configured correctly to not just support what our goals are, but do it securely? Do we have the right processes and procedures in place to, again, do this repeatedly, scalably, measurably, and sustainably? Do we have the right vulnerability and patch management program? Are we just doing the right cyber hygiene things? Is that something that we're keeping up with? All these are key components of enterprise risk. Security control is obviously protecting personally identifiable information or other sensitive data. That has to be there. And not just the control in place, but the monitoring has to be there as well. And the auditor really, again, has to be able to understand how controls are protecting information, what level of control needs to be there to protect that information, and then what level of monitoring the organization needs to do to understand the effectiveness of that control. And then lastly, of course, you have to be able to do the threat detection and the incident response. It's very commonplace to see organizations focus on prevention and preventive controls, but really lack the ability to detect and respond. And that's a weakness that is really very detrimental to an organization. If you can quickly detect, contain, and eradicate issues that you failed to prevent, you're going to change something like a simple malware download, take that from that and avoid it being a data breach. And that's really the barrier, the kind of the delineation point between a functional security program and a non-functional security program, regardless of whether or not it's compliant. We talked about auditor independence before, and so it's important that the auditor is independent, because that freedom from bias is something that's just absolutely critical. Bias is something which could compromise an auditor's opinion. And that auditor's opinion is something that you're going to be handing off to clients or to senior leadership. And if there's bias built into that, then they're getting a flawed perspective or kind of a skewed perspective of what the actual environment looks like. The auditor actually also has a professional obligation to report the truth. And regardless of what sort of information security auditing credential you might have, whether that's CISA or even a CPA, there's a legal responsibility to report the truth. And if there's any sort of personal interest there, it's possible that they may act on their own behalf. And that's not necessarily to say that your auditor is not a trustworthy person, but sometimes bias can even subconsciously influence a result, and it's important to avoid that no matter what. So as we said earlier, it's certainly possible to do internal audits and internal assessments against your security environment, but it's, I think, equally, if not more so important, to have an independent auditor perform that assessment at the end of the day to get that perspective that is absolutely free from bias, because that's really going to be I think the testament to whether or not the security environment is configured correctly. The elements of an information security audit that, again, either an internal person or preferably an external independent auditor is going to be looking at is what you're seeing on screen right now. First off, they're going to do a physical and environmental review. That's going to start with the inventory that we talked about earlier, making sure that we've got all of the assets accounted for and all of the systems across every different site, etc. We're additionally in that same area or that same bubble there going to be looking at the physical and environmental security controls, looking at things like air conditioning or fire suppression, things like that, or even simple locks on doors. That's an equally important component of a physical and environmental security control review. We're also going to be looking at systems administration and how that's being done. Is that being done securely? Is it being done completely? Are we keeping up with patches? Again, are we doing the basic cyber hygiene stuff that is required for a good functional security program? And that stuff is really going to oftentimes highlight the maturity of the organization as a whole, because organizations that have gotten that stuff figured out have moved beyond just the baseline security stuff and are able to focus on the more advanced security initiatives that we're going to talk about in a few minutes here. Things like application software review is a good example of that. A lot of organizations rely upon internal teams to develop custom applications, and oftentimes that's not done securely. Oftentimes there's no such thing as the secure systems development lifecycle. There's just the systems development lifecycle, and maybe at the end there's a vulnerability scan that's done against like a web application, and that's not even always the case. The mature organizations are those that have the security baked into that security development or software development lifecycle process, and the auditor is going to be looking for that sort of thing to again reflect whether or not the organization has kind of done the homework on putting a mature security program in place. The network security review is going to be looking at things like network architecture and controls over both perimeter and also internal access controls between different trust zones. This again is an area where an auditor is going to be looking at the maturity of the organization. I'd say less mature organizations have very flat networks with very little internal access controls, and that's something again an auditor is going to be looking for as kind of a calling card for an organization that is probably lacking some other critical security controls. So organizations that have good internal security controls, have good internal segmentation between different trust zones in the network, that's going to speak well to an auditor. The business continuity review is, I think, a very critical component of an information security audit, because it's going to be taking into account all of the controls that we talked about and also the mission and business drivers of the organization, and really determining whether or not the business has done the homework on how they can keep operating in the event of a disaster or in the event of a service disruption. Again, this is an area where a mature organization will have a very well documented business continuity plan, have a very good disaster recovery process that they probably tested recently. Usually they're going to be looking for something like annual tests, annual updates, things like that, to things like business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans. And again, that's something that's key for pretty much every security control framework that's out there. So compliance is going to be certainly centered around, at least in part, that business continuity process. Then, of course, data integrity review is going to be where we're looking at whether or not the controls around the data that's being processed in the environment creates a situation where it's impossible to inappropriately change data. whether that's as it's moving across the network or while it's sitting in a database. And that's really going to stress test whether or not those access controls in front of a database or in front of some data flow are adequate to protect the information that's there. So these are elements that your information security auditor is going to be looking at. What I think is nice about this diagram is that this applies to any compliance framework you can name, whether that's FSMA, PCI, HIPAA, FFIEC. Each of these are components of every one of those things. And really that's why when we talk about our security mantra, we talk about get security right and compliance is going to come from that. If you've done your homework with respect to each of these areas, then it's very, very likely that you're also going to be compliant with whatever framework it is that's out there. There may be certain things that you've got to do a very specific way for some prescriptive security framework, but by and large, if you've accomplished the objectives in each of these areas, you're going to be compliant. So how do we really go about doing this is, I think, the next question. And our focus is really to take a risk-based approach to how do we do information security auditing. And again, this is whether or not you're doing this via internal resources as kind of a self-assessment, or if an external entity is doing the audit against your environment. The first thing they should really be doing is inventorying, getting a complete understanding of which assets are in the environment, especially which process-sensitive or critical information, which, not just process-sensitive information, but which are really critical functions or critical systems or servers or even people to the business operations, and really understanding the impact of any risks to each of those areas is kind of a key thing of this risk-based approach. But in order to be able to do that, you got to know what information systems are in the environment. It sounds like it's kind of common sense, but I've seen many environments where it's difficult, if not impossible, to produce a complete and accurate inventory kind of at a moment's notice. An auditor is really going to be looking for an organization that can do that. The first day they come in, they're going to ask for a current, up-to-date inventory. So if you have an independent audit coming up, make sure you can do that. Make sure that you can hand off an inventory of all of your assets in the environment. And the more information you can provide there, it's probably in your best interests. Because if you can show an inventory that has not just the hardware assets, but even more interestingly, the software assets that are installed on that hardware, that's going to show a mature organization that is able to reach into each individual system and really understand the risk footprint that's impactful to each of those assets. So important to be able to produce that inventory. Once you have the inventory, you've got to actually perform an assessment against it. We talked a minute ago about identifying criticality of the systems, and that's what we're talking about there with ranking the systems. Those systems which process highly sensitive information, or perhaps systems administrator points where access to many different systems is granted, those are going to probably be the higher ranked systems where there's a higher degree of risk. And that's a key thing to understand as you're looking at your own environment. What are the critical assets in my environment? And it's not just important from a risk assessment perspective, but it also feeds directly into that business continuity planning that we talked about earlier, that your auditor is going to be looking at your ability to function. If you know the criticality of your systems and you've got that well documented, it's going to be relatively easier for you to demonstrate that your BCP, your business continuity plan, actually supports the ongoing operations of your organization in the event of an issue there. You also have to do the identification of risks. Now, this is usually going to be partially technical and partially kind of a documentation review. The technical component of this is going to manifest itself via vulnerability scans and penetration tests, perhaps some control assessments in there. Really understand what issues exist in the environment that we can identify so that we can then move on to the next step, which is really figuring out what the severity of those potential risks are and then what the likelihood of them actually occurring is. Once we understand the potential impact and the likelihood, we can move on to documenting risks against those individual assets, and we do that via what's called a risk register. And the risk register looks like this. Across the columns, we're looking at the impact, and that impact goes from effectively no impact all the way to extreme impact, i.e. take the business out of existence. And then likelihood from rare or never going to happen all the way up to almost certain. And as you can see, if something is a very infrequent, likelihood is very unlikely or rare, and the impact is negligible, there's effectively no risk there. But if it's an unlikely event with an extreme impact, there's a moderate level of risk, and you've got to apply the correct controls to account for that. If something is almost certain to happen, but even still has a minor risk, at the end of the day, because that's going to happen so frequently, that's something you've got to be accounting for, because it's actually a relatively significant risk within the environment. Even though the risk to any individual asset might be minor, it might happen so frequently that it's something you've got to be accounting for at a high level. And of course, if something is likely going to happen and perhaps has an extreme risk, that's really going to be something that you've got to have a significant amount of thought put towards so that you can demonstrate to an auditor that, again, you've accounted for risk to those critical systems and you've put the appropriate countermeasures in place. And an auditor is going to be looking at it from this perspective because they're going to be trying to determine whether or not you've identified potential risks, whether or not you've done this correctly. Maybe they agree or don't agree with your internal assessment, or maybe they're just going to rank you independently of whatever that internal assessment is, and then determine whether or not you have put the appropriate controls in place to deal with the problems in a risk-based manner. So if you haven't already done this within your own environment, it's a useful exercise because it's probably going to illustrate some areas where you maybe don't have the right controls in place, or you haven't put the right amount of attention to addressing some specific risk. So definitely try to map your risk assessment over to a risk register like this. It should help you understand how to move forward from where you're at right now. Okay, so what does the audit process look like? We talked about kind of the oversight and compliance process, but how does an auditor really walk through the process of performing an assessment? And again, this can either be an internal audit or an external audit performed by an independent entity. So this is the waterfall diagram that we use to reflect what an audit looks like. It begins with pre-engagement activities. Really, we're going to be talking about what is the objective of the audit, what are the rules of engagement here, who are the key people that we're going to be talking to, what test methodologies are we going to use to actually assess whether or not the control is appropriate or not, and really kind of understand the next steps within this process. That's the pre-engagement activity. From there, we're going to start collecting data. We're going to be looking at different data sources. We're going to be trying to pull information together to demonstrate whether or not a particular control is effective and whether or not that control meets the requirements of the regulation or the policy, and really just trying to pull that data together in order to then move on to data analysis, which is that next step. And that data analysis is going to be, again, reviewing all of the information that we obtained against both the regulatory framework that we're trying to assess ourselves against, and then additionally against whether or not it's effective. Again, it can't just be paper policy that we're reviewing. We've got to be looking at artifacts of actual execution. Once we've done all that stuff, we're going to develop some recommendations. The auditor is going to be looking at where there were weaknesses identified, where there were strengths, and then identifying how the organization can move forward. If there are critical or material weaknesses, that's really going to be the key area of recommendation. And not all auditors do this, but I think a lot try to work towards it, is really, rather than identify specific individual risks and solve those problems on a one-off basis, look at it more strategically and try to develop recommendations that are focused on root causes that will hopefully impact multiple different weaknesses with kind of singular actions. That's an important component that an auditor, whether it's, again, an internal audit or an external audit, should be looking at. And then lastly in this process is reporting a presentation, presenting the findings to whomever the executive stakeholders are for this. Again, if it's an external entity or auditor that is reporting this, it's probably up to the executive board. If it's internal, it might simply be up the technical organization via the CIO or CISO, for instance. But one way or another, that reporting and presentation is going to be showing off what the key findings were, how those findings were arrived at, and then how the organization should move forward next. So let's drill into each one of these things with a little bit more depth. So the pre-engagement work, first off, especially for an external auditor, they've got to understand the organization. They've got to understand what the mission is, what the key drivers are, what the objectives are for the organization at a high level, how management looks at risk, and by that I'm really speaking specifically to the governance stuff that we talked about at the beginning. What sort of risk tolerance is there within the organization? Then we've obviously got to define the audit scope, and that scope really might be a particular set of controls, might be just a handful of systems, or it might be the entire enterprise. And that's a key aspect of it, because that's obviously going to influence how we move forward from here. And how we move forward from here is really defined in that audit plan. And that audit plan will take into account what the key objectives are and then specific actions we're going to take to get to those objectives. The identification of personnel resources is going to be both on the auditor side and then also on the audited side. So who are the key points of contact that we're going to be interviewing? or we're going to be working with to obtain artifacts, things like that. That's a key aspect of it. So as you go into an audit, especially with an external auditor, try to have that team kind of pre-selected. It's going to be acting as your liaison between the auditor and the control environment. And then contingency actions and escalation paths, I think, is an area that's important and oft overlooked. It may come to pass that during an audit or during an inspection, there may be some critical risk that's identified that is kind of a stop the presses sort of moment, and that's got to get communicated up very, very quickly. So that's important from an escalation standpoint to be able to identify when you do that, on what sort of situation prompts that sort of action, and then who you take that escalated data to. So that's all the pre-engagement work. And we're going to move into data collection. There are many different things that we're going to do from a data collection standpoint. We're going to review whatever documentation currently exists. Almost certainly going to be looking at the information security policies. We want to look at process documentation. We want to verify whether or not those processes and policies are actually implemented and they're effective. And so that's why we've got to look at artifacts. And so usually during this area, we're going to be asking for artifacts that will demonstrate that a particular control is being applied or a process is being followed. Also, interviews of key personnel is going to be a really important component of this because those key personnel usually are the ones that are responsible for executing the process, and they should be able to talk about the process and how it works and what they do to effectuate it, things like that. Those interviews are also going to be important to document. The auditor should take very, very good notes of the things that are discussed during the interviews, and of course make sure that the people that are being interviewed understand that their comments are made in confidence. A lot of times, especially when there's an external auditor involved, individuals don't necessarily want to expose the dirty laundry, but it's important that they do because that's really the only way that management's going to have a clear understanding of what the actual risk environment looks like and also what the current compliance state is. Also, an auditor is going to be trying to do direct observation, going to be effectively shoulder surfing over a person responsible for performing an action or watching some automation occur, and not necessarily in an active manner. They're not going to be testing necessarily, just really observing whether or not a control is functioning the way it's supposed to do. The testing component of it is an important process as well. We say there use trustworthy tools. What does that mean? So what we're talking about there is ensuring that tools have been downloaded from a trusted source, that we're not running any potentially dangerous tools within a client environment or within your own environment, and making sure that they're going to produce actual correct and accurate information. Important to do that. And so there are some auditor toolkits out there that exist that can be downloaded from kind of common repositories, and that's typically what we recommend you do, especially if you're doing an internal assessment for maybe the first time. The other thing you got to make sure that you do when you're doing a test, especially against an internal organization, is make sure that you're not going to disrupt operations. This is probably very well known amongst the audience here, but security tools can be very disruptive to operational environments, especially vulnerability scanners or penetration tests, things like that. Make sure that they're done either outside of normal business hours or that they're very well communicated to whomever is being audited so that they kind of know what to expect. A lot of times the way that we see this go wrong is a vulnerability scan or penetration test is done, but nobody's alerted the SOC, the Security Operations Center, or the managed services provider that's doing the monitoring. And it fires off thousands of alerts that the people have to respond to, where if there had just been good communication of what was going on from a testing perspective, then that would have all been avoided. So once we have all that, we've got a huge amount of data at that point. So what do we do with it? We need to analyze it. We've got to take a look at the technical reports that are coming out of the tools that we just used. We've got to look for indicators of weaknesses. A high number of vulnerabilities, a good indicator of a weakness, a policy that is inefficient or inadequate to actually protect some information is another good sign of a weakness. We're going to be reviewing the interviews and looking at artifacts to make sure that the artifacts line up with what the auditor was told, and whether or not the artifacts actually demonstrate that the control is in place or not. And then we're going to look at whether or not those controls are compliant. Some control frameworks are very prescriptive with respect to how controls must be implemented. Some are not. Those that are prescriptive, the auditor will be kind of running down a checklist against For instance, a good example here is perhaps the USGCB, the United States Government Configuration Baseline. So that's a very prescriptive set of controls that have to be in place in order to be compliant, and you can simply check boxes to make sure that those are actually done. Other compliance requirements are going to be less prescriptive and will require some auditor opinion. And that's really going to be up to that individual auditor. The people that are being audited will have the opportunity to put their opinion in place once the after the post-assessment stuff is kicked off. But in the meantime, the auditor is really going to be using their own professional opinion. Are these controls compliant? Are there areas of low compliance? Are there areas where perhaps a broad set of controls we're not doing too well at? Because that's really how we're going to focus in on identifying what are the highest risks to the organization and how do we identify the weaknesses that we can try to solve in, again, that kind of strategic manner. I think a good example of this is configuration and change management. Oftentimes we see organizations that there's a high number of vulnerabilities, many different types of applications in the environment, many different versions of applications, and subsequently a very low level of change management that's actually in place. And so putting a process in that effectuates good change management probably solves the vast majority of those issues all at once. And that's what we're really going to be trying to do when we measure risk. We're going to be looking at what's the highest likelihood, highest impact, and try to categorize and rank the different weaknesses and risks that we identified in a manner that will enable us to move forward efficiently and with best use of resources that the organization has available. This is often a hard thing to do. There are a couple different ways to measure risk. It can either be a qualitative or a quantitative assessment. A qualitative is going to really simply be like a low, medium, or high risk, whereas a quantitative assessment is going to be more based around numbers, like how much money will the organization lose if a particular risk comes to light. And there are certainly pros and cons to doing both or doing one or the other. The pros to doing a qualitative risk assessment are that it's usually much cheaper and quicker to get through a qualitative risk assessment than it is a quantitative risk assessment. However, a quantitative risk assessment might yield more granular information about how much money should be spent to solve a particular risk, because you never want to spend more money on a countermeasure than you could potentially lose if a risk actually were to occur. And that's really how the recommendations are going to be developed as well. We're going to look at the root causes that are actually creating these risks. We're going to think about how does the organization sustainably overcome these problems. And of course, the answers are all going to be prioritized based upon the impact of the organization. So you remember that risk register earlier. Those risks that fall into that kind of high or the red area are going to be the ones that are the key recommendations are going to come out of. And that's really where the auditors are directing the organization to put the maximum amount of attention, because that's going to have the highest impact on the organization in the shortest period of time. Or inversely, it might be the area where the organization has to put the most work towards, and so better get started on it sooner than later. But those recommendations will flow out of the process and will be manifested via a number of different artifacts that the auditor, again, whether it's an internal audit or an external audit, will be delivering. First off, the auditor's opinion, and that's really going to be a narrative statement that says effectively how well the organization is doing from a compliance perspective. Were key risks identified? Were there material weaknesses that would prompt the auditor to believe the organization is non-compliant? That's what you'll find in the auditor's opinion. There will be an executive summary that will accompany this that's really got the key weaknesses and the key recommendations contained in it. We'll probably include some information about the overall audit process, the engagement as a whole, that again, the executive can use to kind of learn about what was uncovered and what needs to happen next, so that again, they can flow that back into the governance process and then make some changes to the organization with this new information which has come to light. The risk assessment report is going to be more technical or more granular in detail. It's going to get into specific risks that were identified, specific impact and likelihood, and also how those risks were identified, and really rank those in a manner that's, again, based upon the impact of the organization. Then the recommendations are going to be the next thing that's going to come out of that. It's going to map very, very closely to that risk assessment report. The recommendations will be prioritized based upon either what's the highest risk to the organization or what's the most impactful recommendation that can be put into place to solve as many problems as possible. but it will be prioritized, and that's a key thing that even if you're doing an internal self-assessment, you have to do that, because take the manager's perspective on this, there's a finite set of resources available to solve problems, and that list has to be prioritized so that they know where to direct those resources the most efficient way possible. Then, of course, there's going to be a detailed list, and that detailed list is what you're going to hand off to the people who are responsible for implementing specific controls or writing specific policies or things like that. Usually it's going to be a long report with either many vulnerabilities or a detailed listing of weaknesses, and a lot more tactically focused than the strategic stuff that's at the top of this list here. So we talked about controls and control assessments. What are we really getting at here? So first off, I'm going to remind you guys that we did a webinar specific to controls. That was actually the last one that we did, called it Control Freak. There's much information out there with respect to what controls should be implemented within an environment, and then how to go about implementing effective controls. But at a high level, controls, not necessarily technical, might be a process. A policy could potentially even be a control, that as long as it's enforced and measured and monitored. But really, they're these things which are designed to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information or information processing systems. It's really what is the kind of where the rubber meets the road with respect to your security program. There are many different types of controls. They're typically bundled into preventive, detective, and mitigating or compensating controls. And we'll talk a little bit about more of each of those. The control environment is effectively the entire environment of that set of controls that's used to protect that set of information that the organization is trying to protect, where the sensitive information exists, or if the, again, if that audit process has been scoped down to a narrow subset, the control environment that's within the auspices of that audit is really just going to be that. But basically, it's everything that could impact the effectiveness of that control. The assets themselves, the tools which are used to put controls in place, things like that. That's all within the control environment. We talked a little bit about control assessment approaches earlier with respect to observation, testing, documentation review, and interviews. And any of these can be used. Depending upon what type of control it is that we're talking about, one approach might be more effective than another, or might be more appropriate than another. For something like whether or not an automated control is working, observation might be the best way to do that. But to determine whether or not an organization is keeping up with cyber hygiene stuff, testing is probably more appropriate, because that will provide an accurate perspective on, again, how many vulnerabilities exist, how far behind are we on patching, things like that. Interviews, I think, are important and useful control assessment approaches when we're talking about things like business continuity and incident response. Do the key stakeholders for those different initiatives understand what their roles are? Do they understand what they've got to do in the event of a disaster or in the event of a security incident? Important that the interview uncovers that, because while it may be well documented in perhaps an incident response plan or a business continuity plan, if the key stakeholders or key personnel responsible for those different actions aren't able to articulate that, then it probably means that hasn't been tested or hasn't been executed anytime recently, or hasn't been trained upon. And those are deficiencies you're going to want to identify as you go through this process, so that, again, you can feed that information back up to senior management and changes can be made around how that stuff is effectuated. The documentation review is always going to be important, because how well documented an organization is usually a pretty good testament to how mature the organization is. So things like network diagrams, architecture diagrams, policies and processes, all that stuff adds up to kind of a run book of the security environment for the organization. And it's useful to review that stuff again, if for nothing else, to look at how mature the organization is. But you can use any of these different approaches. Again, there's probably situations where some are more appropriate than others. But at the end of the day, you've performed this assessment, and what we want to do is the after-assessment stuff. How do we actually use this information to get better? Really what we're trying to do is mature the program over time. So the risk assessment that we just undertook, whether, again, that's an external audit or we did it internally, is what should come out of that is a security program roadmap. And that's really why it's important to prioritize those recommendations, because with that prioritization in mind, you can put together a roadmap which lays out what, again, maybe something like the next 18 months looks like, or it might be even 36 months or 5 years, depending upon where you're at in your maturity life cycle. But that prioritized list of recommendations is what's going to influence that. And it's not just the recommendations themselves, but also the strategic goals of the organization. So it's important that this is done collaboratively. Building that roadmap is done collaboratively between the organization responsible for auditing and oversight, and then senior management who can review that, provide some input and influence over the results, and then guide the organization forward in a manner that's going to achieve both their business objectives and also their security objectives, with really the end goal being that mature cybersecurity program. A mature cybersecurity program is one that is compliant by default. So if you're able to do all the things we talked about sustainably, repeatably, measurably, et cetera, again, you're going to be compliant and you're going to have a security program that's efficient and cost effective. And like we said earlier, I think the most important component of everything with respect to oversight and compliance is that output gets fed back to senior management so that they can improvise, adapt, and overcome, so that we can learn from this entire process. We started off by management setting the tone and kind of developing that risk tolerance of the organization, develop some policies to support that, and also the regulatory environment of the organization, develop some process to repeatably, sustainably, measurably go through the actual the process of implementing security controls. The controls themselves, again, where the rubber meets the road of the technical components of ensuring security in the organization. We've assessed all that stuff, we've tested it, we've observed it, we've reviewed the documentation. How well did we actually do with this whole process? And that's the message that's got to get delivered back to management. Once that understanding is clear, how well did we do, what do we have to do next, then the senior leadership can take a look at that and really guide the organization where they need to go. Perhaps what they set as a risk tolerance was not adequate for what level of information or sensitivity is actually being processed in the environment. It's certainly a possible outcome. Perhaps they may find that they're overspending on certain areas that are highly compliant, while others are languishing with underfunding and very non-compliant. And that's a very important thing to identify during this process. And again, not necessarily just compliance, but adequacy of the controls and adequacy of security itself. Important that management learns this on a regular basis. So one question we tend to get a lot is how often should this process be performed? And our opinion on that is that an internal audit should certainly be done at least every year, probably more so like quarterly, to run through an assessment of your internal controls. Might not necessarily be your entire environment that you're reviewing quarterly, but certainly taking a look at those key technical controls, doing control assessments around that stuff on a regular basis, because those are a lot more tactical, and if you wait too long to assess those, you're effectively just taking snapshots in time that you can't learn too much from. And additionally, an external independent auditor should perform a control assessment against your organization, usually annually. That's almost certainly going to be a requirement for most of the compliance mandates that we talked about today. Usually not more than annual for an external auditor to do it, but almost certainly annual. So that, again, is going to provide management with the situational awareness that they need in order to make decisions and move the organization where they're trying to take it. And also, that's going to enable them to really figure out how best to manage risk for the organization. And there are different strategies that they can choose to with respect to risk management. First up, they may transfer risk, and that really is along the lines of something like buying insurance, or perhaps engaging a managed services provider to provide some key controls. That managed services provider is probably going to own some liability around it, so there's some risk that's transferred in that regard. Or they may choose to avoid a specific risk. So maybe they identify some significant challenges around a particular area of the business and decide to close that area of the business down. That's certainly a way to avoid some risk. They may also implement some countermeasures to remove or reduce the probability of the risk. That's usually what we talked about with a compensating control. They may make things more difficult for a risk to come to light. So when we talked about that risk register earlier, putting countermeasures in place to take something that's likely or almost certain down to unlikely or rare. They may actually also just choose to accept the risk. That's of course going to be up to senior leadership's prerogative. If they deem a risk too low to worry about, then simply accept it and move on. There's always going to be some residual risk that's left that the organization has to accept because it's impossible to reduce risk all the way to zero. So accepting risk may be an appropriate course of action. An external auditor may have a different opinion on that, and that will usually come up during the next annual audit that the organization has to go through. If perhaps an external auditor is deemed that they were too tolerant of a risk and accepted too high a risk, that will usually appear in that auditor's opinion the following cycle. Okay, so that's really the entirety of the oversight and compliance process that we wanted to talk through today. Again, it's certainly possible to do this internally, but I think it's equally important to look at how do we ensure that we've got that freedom from bias and make sure that we have an external entity doing at least an annual assessment for us. Do we have any questions here? Let's see, we've got a couple. Okay, so let's see. Who needs to take ownership of this oversight and compliance process? What members of the team need to be involved? Okay, so that's a good question. So ownership of the oversight and compliance process is almost certainly going to be like the senior executive leadership. At the end of the day, senior executive leadership are the individuals and that the group within the organization that's ultimately accountable for the risk of the organization and also for the compliance. So this all really needs to be driven by them. Senior leadership may delegate specific actions of the oversight and compliance process to perhaps the CIO or perhaps a chief compliance officer if an organization is mature enough to have a chief compliance officer. But at the end of the day, since senior executive leadership is accountable, and in many of these regulations, there are individual liabilities up to and including jail time for noncompliance. They're the ones that have to be in ownership of the process. Team members that need to be involved, that's an interesting aspect of the question as well. So depending upon the scope of the assessment or the scope of the audit, you may need to involve team members from very different sectors of the organization. You're almost certainly going to need to have the technical organization involved in an assessment, but you're probably also going to need to have a group like perhaps accounting or even HR really looking at how well we're protecting personally identifiable information. Are we doing the right things from an employee onboarding and background check perspective? So it could be a very large swath of the organization. Generally, if it's a full enterprise risk assessment, if you remember all those different quadrants that were in that diagram we showed earlier, you're going to need a senior leader from each functional area of the organization to participate, or at least to delegate participation to a member of their team. It's important that those stakeholders are senior enough to kind of understand the big picture of even just their own functional area, but better yet, the organization as a whole, but still tactical enough that they can actually do and produce the artifacts that the auditors are going to require. So again, there's probably some component of it that gets delegated down, but each functional area should be represented by that. Okay, next question is where do we go to find an external auditor? There are many resources for that. It really depends upon the regulation that you're talking about. For something like, for instance, a SOC 2, that's Service Organization Controls, you're going to have to go to a CPA firm for that. For something like FSMA or PCI, there are organizations out there that can do control assessments against them. Certain regulations, you have to be a qualified assessor, and the regulatory framework generally will specify whether or not you need a qualified assessor or not, and there exist databases of entities that are able and available to do those sort of things for you. Of course, there's always the option to utilize the services of a cybersecurity company like TruShield to perform an external assessment for you. Organizations like ours have a very broad perspective across many different industries, and that's often useful when you're looking at security control, maturity, and compliance across a varying different set of regulatory frameworks. So it's certainly something we can help with as well. Even if you just want some opinion on where to go next from a assessment perspective, whether or not you can handle it with internal resources or should you even engage an external entity, we can help with that as well. Any other questions? Okay. No other questions. So again, folks, that is the entirety of our Building a Security Program series of webinars. We appreciate you sticking around for this multi-month effort. Hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully this is information you can take back to your organization and really put in place a sustainable and mature security program, again with the focus being on protecting sensitive information, with compliance being an output of that process. If you have additional questions at any point in time, please feel free to reach out to us either on our website, the phone number there, or the contact information that I gave you at the beginning. We're always happy to take questions. Again, thank you.